In that reading today from the beginning of John's Gospel, John starts in a completely different place to the other Gospel writers. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all begin with the beginnings of Jesus' life on earth, with the nativity story. But John starts in an unusual place. We've got no angels, no birth, no Mary, no Joseph, no shepherds, no magi, and not a donkey in sight. John launches his gospel with a cosmic, before the beginning of the universe, view of this baby that was born to be king, as the Word that became flesh. And John begins his account of the life of Jesus with what the theologian N.T. Wright calls the full meaning of everything Jesus was and is and did. John gives us the backstory that helps us to understand what lies behind everything that Jesus was, did, and is, and what we celebrate at Christmas. He introduces us to the King of the universe. And yet, we know Jesus is a king like no other. His rule and reign over and in this world that he loves so much is unusual. So today, we're going to be thinking about this unusual king and the three key things that make him so unusual. And firstly, the unusual king becomes one of us. The Word became flesh. Did you know that the crown that King Charles III wore at his coronation is said to be worth £400 million? Now, granted, he only wears it on state occasions. But Jesus, the unusual king, wore a crown made of thorns. A crown that wasn't worth anything, but cost him everything. To know what God is like, we need to look hard at Jesus. Paul tells us in Philippians 2:7, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. Now, in the opening of John's Gospel, we're told that Jesus was there at the beginning of everything, overseeing creation. Power beyond our imagining. And yet, he makes himself nothing and becomes a living, breathing, laughing, crying, serving, suffering, rejoicing human being. Isn't that something worth reflecting on in this Advent season? Isn't it something worth remembering when we're tempted to think of God as remote and distant and uncaring about what's happening to us here and now? Jesus becomes one of us and suffers as we suffer, knows what it is to be fully human, every single aspect of it. And this unusual king is humble. Now, today we might admire someone who is humble, who demonstrates humility. But that wasn't necessarily the case in Jesus' day, which makes him the more unusual in his time and place. Historians will tell you that in the Roman world, humility was not considered a virtue. What was prized was honor, having your qualities recognized and your name praised. To boast about your achievements was not just culturally acceptable, it was expected in the Greco-Roman society. Seems to me that that's not a lot of difference in our society today. Jesus shows us what true power is. The humility of his divine status and nature reveals a love that in dying for the sake of the world transforms those it touches. Surely this humble, unusual act of a king is the path to a revolution that our world needs today. To empty ourselves of our self-importance and lay our lives down for the sake of others. And maybe when we're tempted to feel sorry for ourselves, if we feel we're being overlooked, how might we take the hand of Jesus and allow him to lead us in the way of humility? How do we join the revolution of this king today? What would it look like for you this week? Perhaps celebrating the accomplishments of our friends rather than our own, even when it hurts to do so. It could mean noticing our desire to be noticed, or have our voice or opinion heard, or to receive thanks for what we do, and instead lay down any resentment that might be there when we're not experiencing that. Can we just faithfully do what needs to be done? This is the way of the unusual king, and it doesn't go unnoticed in his eyes. So what else is unusual about our cosmic king? What's unusual is that he moves into our neighborhood. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. That's the second key thing to note. Eugene Peterson's The Message version of the Bible expresses it in this way: the Word became flesh and blood and moved into the neighborhood. Just imagine that for a moment. The king moving into our neighborhood. It's hard to imagine what it would be like for any king to move into our neighborhood. I wonder whether you would hope to catch a glimpse as he drives by in his bulletproof car. Or maybe hope for a brief chat if you meet him when he's out for a walk with his dogs. Or would you shrug your shoulders, not giving a jot if you saw him or not, because really what difference does he make to your life? But imagine the King of the universe moving into this neighborhood, living amongst us in Errol and St Meadows and in Stewart and Abernight and all along the Carse. How would we receive him? Where would we find him? Our unusual king was born in a town that had to be defined as Bethlehem in Judea to avoid confusion with other Bethlehems. He lived most of his life in a builder's house, working in his father's workshop. This unusual, humble king subjected himself to the distresses and disasters of our everyday lives. He chose to live in the same world as us and experience the same daily demands and pressures of life in our village, town, or city. The one who had lived among the angels now lived among even the ones who didn't recognize or accept him. Now, the word dwelt in the Greek word is the Greek word for tent. In Jesus, God pitched his tent among us. The Jews had hoped for a king in a huge temple, invincible to the invading powers. But God became human and pitched his tent among us. Living in a tent is a fragile existence. We're called to live out the life of this king in our neighborhood, to live amongst the lonely, the lost, those who might threaten us, like Jesus, and to be a light of hope to them. And finally, John tells us that this unusual king is full of grace and truth. Now, a usual king might declare edicts and state laws, at least in countries where the king rules. Now we have parliaments that do that on his behalf. It's unusual for a king to be known for their grace. For the Jews, the old temple contained a law that could show where you had wronged. But the baby born to be king embodied grace and truth. And when he grew up, this king encountered a woman at the well, or a woman caught in adultery, or a money-grabbing little tax collector, or a follower who betrayed him in a moment of need. This king told them the truth, but his grace also set them free. He didn't condemn or seek to punish. He gave them a fresh start with a changed heart. Do you know, it's interesting, so often when we look to God in everyday life, when we look to him in our troubles, when we cry out in prayer, we often say, look up. But this passage shows us that we have a God who comes down to earth, a God who's one of us, a God who dwells in our neighborhood, dwells in our hearts, dwells with us, full of grace and truth. This year has been a year of elections. Globally, more voters than ever before have been to the polls. More than 80 countries have sought new leaders to govern civic light. And as we voted, we may well have been asking ourselves, will this leader be interested in the issues we face in our neighborhood? Will this leader guide us into a future where the next generation will flourish? Is this leader humble and trustworthy, and do they understand the everyday issues most of us face? Where's the hope for us in that? Jesus, the unusual King, comes to identify himself with us. He comes for the least and the lost. Jesus, the unusual King, moves into our neighbourhood, not removed from the reality of everyday life, but living everyday life alongside us. Are we ready to bow the knee to a King like this? And so for each one of us at the start of Advent, as we take time to remember who it is that we're going to be celebrating the coming of, our wonderfully unusual King, and all our unusual way of life. It calls us to an unusual way of life. And it's good news. The good news is that we are called to be down to earth, relatable, humble people who bring heaven to earth in our neighbourhood. And that's what we are. So we can prayerfully ask, what would our neighbour look like if our God rules and reigns there? How will it impact our schools, our parks, our workplaces, our leisure places, our streets and our homes? And then we can recognise that God is working his mission through us. And he has us in those places to make a difference for him. So maybe some down-to-earth ways of making a difference this week. Maybe you've done some of this before. Writing a thank you card to your bin men or the delivery people or others on your front line that are unlikely to be thanked for what they do. Maybe you can take a baking gift to a neighbour that you haven't met yet or a colleague at work. As we prepare for Christmas, let our words become flesh. We're invited to turn our love into action and attempt something unusual to bless our friends and neighbours this Christmas. And if we're the ones in need of hope and help at the moment, keep your eyes and ears open. You may just catch a glimpse of him through the lives of those around you. Amen.